the next panel is about inclusionary zoning, and I'm really excited about it, but I won't tell you why, because Martine will.
Hi, everybody. You may be thinking, oh, her again, but with a sweater. I'm cold and moderating this session, and we have three great presenters that are going to talk to us about inclusionary zoning, which came up in this morning's discussion. So what is inclusionary zoning? I'll briefly say a few words and then we'll get going. It's a tool that's used in planning to require affordable housing be provided in new residential developments. So it's ultimately a market-oriented tool that aims to leverage market development to promote affordability goals. In April 2018, the province of Ontario passed enabling legislation, which would allow municipalities to introduce their own inclusionary zoning policies. And so municipalities in the province got to work trying to do this. And then recently, as of last week, Bill 108 was introduced, called the More Homes, More Choice Act. And this has significantly limited, well, I mean, I guess the panel can speak to this, limited the potential of inclusionary zoning policies. So in this bill, municipalities can introduce inclusionary zoning rather than being able to apply it everywhere. There's now restrictions on where inclusionary zoning policies can be enforced. And that is in two types of places around a protected major station area, so public transit areas, and then also in an area with a development permit system established. So right now, people who are trying to work to implement inclusionary zoning in the province are suddenly working on it with the rules being changed. So we have three excellent panelists who are going to discuss the potential of inclusionary zoning. First of all, we'll have Richard Drdla. Actually, you can come up now and I'll continue to talk. Richard is a Toronto-based affordable housing consultant, and he's been actively engaged in research, writing, and advocacy around inclusionary zoning for 20 years. And so he's got lots to say about this. After him, we will hear from Deanna Chorney with the City of Toronto, where she's a project manager around inclusionary zoning. And then we'll hear from Mike Layton, who is the City Councillor for Ward 11, University Rosedale. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Richard.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'll be talking briefly about what inclusionary zoning is, and then proceeding to talk about the potential for inclusionary zoning in the city and some of the obstacles and challenges to meeting that potential. If you need more information beyond what I'm going to give you, I refer you to my website, inclusionaryzoning.ca. That's inclusionaryzoning.ca, one word, which has my writings on the subject, but also a lot of other information and basic literature on the subject, which I think you'll find useful if you're really interested in this subject. So, as mentioned, inclusionary zoning, what is it? It is essentially a regulatory tool used by municipalities to require developers to provide some proportion of affordable housing, typically best practices say at the moment 20% of their housing in market units, in market developments for affordable housing. The inclusionary zoning is used predominantly now in the United States, where it is found in roughly 500 communities, including most of the major premier cities, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., the list goes on and on. It started was initiated in about 1970 in the States, and has grown, as I say, now to 500 communities using it. It is, well, you should start asking yourself the question right now is, well, why in the hell we aren't using it, considering how widely it is used and successfully used. I want to go through some of the major features of what makes inclusionary zoning different and distinctive and productive. First of all, as I said before, it is a municipal program. And by that I mean these programs have been designed, conceived, crafted by municipalities to provide affordable housing in the absence of, without the dictation and direction of the states. These are municipal programs that they've created for themselves, and they've created them to provide for what they consider to be their priority needs, not necessarily what the state and federal governments conceive as being important. So they are locally crafted, serving their housing needs. They are obviously inclusionary programs. And what I mean by that is that they are directed at the notion that all development should include some proportion of affordable housing, and that it should be integrated and scattered in time throughout the community. These programs do not consign or limit affordable housing to particular areas. They want to integrate it fully across the community. They are inclusionary projects or programs. The provision of affordable housing in these programs, by and large, is mandatory. All developers are required to participate and provide the affordable housing. In the past, there are still, and there still exist, voluntary programs, and by that I mean programs in which the municipalities use incentives to encourage developers, not require them for affordable housing. These have been proven quite unsuccessful over time, and indeed are no longer considered credible ways of doing affordable housing. So indeed, mandatory is essentially also an essential feature of these inclusionary zoning programs, and voluntary programs have gone to the side and are really not used anymore to an extent. Another key feature is that these programs essentially are universal to all projects in a city. They apply across the board to all developments and to all developers. Notably, they are applied to what is called, or I would call, as-of-right developments. That is, developments going on within the current approved zoning. They are not applied only to rezoning, as in the case of, for example, Section 37. Section 37 depends upon applies them only to developments getting increased density. This is not true of inclusionary zoning. It applies to all developments, even though those who get additional benefits through the planning approval. And the last feature I want to point out is that basically the requirements in these programs are non-negotiable. They're fixed. Unlike Section 37, which everything is negotiated, they are fixed in time, in advance. And this is rather a critical feature I'll come back to, because it really relates to who actually pays for this housing in the long term. So I'll hit that feature in a second again. Okay, so what about Ontario? Where do we stand? Well, it's become topical for the reasons that have just been mentioned by Martine. That is, 2.5 years ago, the government finally passed the legislation enabling it, and after dithering for a year and a half, a year ago, they also introduced the regulations that made it operational. Since then, the City of Toronto, for example, has started initial work on preparing their proposals, and Deanna will mention that later on. There are other cities, such as Hamilton, Ottawa, and London, I'm aware of, have expressed interest and are deeply interested in using this tool, but at the moment, it seems nobody else has really gone very far in developing their proposals to date. The legislation to date is good legislation. It's permissive legislation. And by that I mean it gives great flexibility to the municipalities to craft their own programs and address their own housing needs. There is one caveat to that, and that is, I have one concern about the current legislation, and that is the legislation does, or the current regulations, require municipalities to use financial assessments. I'm concerned about that in terms of what it may do in terms of requiring developers to provide, or municipalities to provide compensation for developers. I'll come back to that point in a couple of minutes. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, Bill 108, which has just been introduced. And frankly, I think the bill is a disaster. By limiting the use of inclusionary zoning to only a narrow range of sites, it is really reduced considerably the amount of affordable housing we'll ever achieve, because unlike inclusionary zoning, as I described, which is universal and goes across the whole city, under these provisions, it'll be used only in very selective areas. And furthermore, by adding another layer of requirements to the DPS system, it means that we are going to have to do additional work, which is going to delay by many, many years the production of affordable housing. So the combination of the two, of the long delay and also the narrow focus of where they can be applied, means we're going to get very little affordable housing, and that affordable housing doesn't come very late. So in my mind, it's really a disaster, and it's indicative that the provincial government really doesn't care very much about providing for affordable housing. Now, there's one way out of this, if possible, and that is New York City gives an example of perhaps how this might be handled. New York City uses essentially something similar to the DPS system. And what it has done in its latest policies is identified about a dozen neighborhoods to which they apply DPS. And these neighborhoods, in their mind, need special consideration because they're vulnerable to redevelopment, and they want to protect the existing population living in these neighborhoods. So they apply DPS to about 12 neighborhoods. But in addition, what is different there, and unlike what's going to happen here for the moment, is they actually apply inclusionary zoning to the entire rest of the community. So they do two things at the same time. They apply a universal inclusionary zoning system, and so everybody's affected. At the same time, they give special care and consideration to a dozen areas which need the special attention in order to deal with local problems that the normal system couldn't provide for. I suggest and hope that perhaps this is the way out of using this system by allowing for this additional provision, which would meet perhaps the concerns of the ministry regarding DPS, but allow for inclusionary zoning to be more widely used. As for the potential, if we would use inclusionary zoning as used in the States, and we would provide rigorous and demanding provisions, I would estimate that we could perhaps get an order of 2,500 units per year. That's a considerable amount of housing production, and it's something that we should be obviously striving for. But this will depend upon using quite rigorous and demanding provisions. And this figure could not be achieved under the provisions of the Bill 108, but it would be if we actually use the provisions widely used in the U.S. and applied them here, this is the sort of number we would get. Now, there are concerns about getting that target, and among others, there's the Bill 108. There are the notion that we might not apply it across the board. There's the possibility that it might be, we might put large caps on the amount of development, or the size of the developments that we would apply. But the other major concern I have is also one of compensation. The developers in Ontario have been consistently and persistently looking for and demanding for compensation from the municipality for providing this housing. I would suggest that this provision is not necessary. At least the experience in the United States show that these developments can proceed, inclusionary zoning can proceed without compensation. I would also submit that it is entirely unwarranted. And it's unwarranted for reasons I'd like to go into a little briefly now. And when we talk about, and to do so, I want to talk about who pays for this affordable housing. This is a key issue in these programs, and it helps to understand how to develop them and to justify and support them. I submit that the developers do not shoulder the cost burden associated with inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning does create a cost burden, and that cost burden is the difference between the market value of the housing that is being built and the affordable value that is demanded from them. So there is a cost burden. But the developers do not shoulder this burden. And despite all their whinging, I have never heard them ever say they do. What they do say is that they will cut back on production. That's not quite the same thing as saying that they will absorb the cost of this housing. They also say that they will pass it on to the home buyers. And this is really fear-mongering, because there are studies that clearly show that there is no passing of this cost to the home buyers. In the programs in the U.S., there has been no indication that house prices in these communities go up where there is inclusionary zoning. Now, the municipalities don't pay for this. They don't offer compensation for it. So the question is, if the municipalities don't pay for it, the home buyers don't pay for it, and the developers don't pay for it, I guess who pays for it? Well, we've come to the understanding now that in the States that it's really passed back to the land, to use the terminology there. Most authorities now believe that indeed the landowners must absorb this cost. What happens is the developers, if provided they know ahead of time what the cost of the obligation is, the cost of providing the affordable housing, they will in turn offer less to purchase the land. So it forces the landowners to provide to support the affordable housing and pay for that cost. Now, I believe that's entirely reasonable and justifiable possibility, because landowners in places like in Toronto and elsewhere have gained enormous benefit. In some cases, considerable, if not enormous, and unanticipated benefits from the rise of land values caused by the high growth in these cities. And furthermore, they've done nothing to earn that high growth or that additional benefit. It's a windfall to them. On the other hand, the municipalities in many cases have had a hand in creating those values. They do it through in infrastructure investment. They also do it in their planning decisions. So the argument is that, frankly, the municipality should be able to capture back some of that land value and use it for affordable housing, if not other community benefits. This is now called a land value capture. It's something that's being now considered much more in the literature, and it's something you may want to follow up on. Now, there are limitations to what the inclusionary zoning can provide, and this is it's important to deal with some of these. First of all, in the States, inclusionary zoning has provided for affordable housing more than it has provided rental housing. This is because, simply put, these programs take a share of what the municipalities, what the developers are going to provide. If the developers are going to provide ownership housing, then you're going to get a share of ownership housing through affordable ownership housing. And in the States, typically 90% of the housing provided by inclusionary zoning is ownership or affordable ownership. So that's an issue, one issue that we have to deal with. The other one is that the housing provided by these programs typically is moderate income housing rather than low income housing. These programs do not attempt to replace or replace existing social housing programs or to try to meet the same low-income housing needs. They provide housing, what is considered to be below market housing, a term that's not used wide in the States but is not widely used here. And what that housing means is that it is housing built or provided at a price or rent distinctly below that the market is providing under new construction. In a sense, the target of these programs is to provide housing in the gap between what is provided by the market and what the social housing or public housing programs are providing. It is housing that is essentially for people that are not eligible for social housing but cannot afford market housing. Now, this has not served many, perhaps the goals and needs or is not felt to serve the goals and needs of what we should be trying to provide in the City of Toronto. So one of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with is how to, in a sense, tweak or enhance these systems to provide for deeper affordability and provide more rental housing. This is quite a challenge, and and it's something that, frankly, we're going to have to give more time to consider. There are two prospects that come out, possibilities that have been identified in the States, but neither one of them is totally the answer. And one is to use fees in lieu. In other words, to allow the developers to buy out their obligation and to use those fees to build income for lower income people, housing for lower income people, or for special needs. The problem with that at the moment is that the current legislation prohibits the use of fees in lieu in Ontario. I think that was a mistake, but and it's something we'll have to perhaps address later on, but for the moment it rules out using fees in lieu. The other possibility, obviously, is to enable the affordable housing nonprofit sector to buy some of these units and to rent them. This is done also widely in the States, but it takes money. In other words, they aren't going to be giving these units for free. They have to buy them at the discounted price. And in the States, even though this is done widely, the affordable housing sector, the nonprofit sector, is able to buy only a very small percentage of the units that come on stream because they just lack the resources. So presumably we're going to have the same problem as well. So anyway, this is a challenge we're going to have to deal with in due course. I think my time is up.